Today we're going to be chatting about The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. Before we begin, I want to mention that this review will contain spoilers, so if you haven't read this book already and it's something that you want to read, I'd recommend exiting this video and coming back after you've had a chance to read it. I think this book is categorized as fantasy. I would also consider it to be cozy and YA. Let's start with the things I loved about this book. I loved how cozy and comforting it was to read. I didn't necessarily find this to be a page turner, but I did look forward to reading it, and I read it at a very steady pace, a very relaxing and just leisurely pace. So I really loved this book for, I guess it would be the writing style, the characters, the plot. I just found everything very cozy and comforting. The other thing I loved about this book were the children. The children in this book are magical creatures and they are just so delightful. I found that their personalities really came to life in this book for me, and I found that these characters were very endearing and also quite funny. I've mentioned in previous review videos that I really love humorous bits in books, and I would say there were a few places where I chuckled out loud in this book, and it just felt like a very delightful read, especially when I learned more about these magical children. The last thing I loved about this book is that the main protagonist is middle-aged. I am middle-aged myself. I am turning 47 years old in about a month or so, and it was really lovely to have two middle-aged main characters in this book who develop a romantic relationship. And the romance was done very subtly. It didn't feel gratuitous. It felt like it needed to be in the story. So I really, really loved that about this book, that it handled romance so well and that it featured a couple of middle-aged characters. The main drawback to this book for me was that the pacing at the beginning I found was a little bit slow and a little bit repetitive in terms of the way certain people or certain things were described. In the first part of the book, we meet the main character, Linus Baker. He has a very monotonous job in an organization that is very controlling. It feels like the author was trying to build suspense, having the reader wonder why Linus Baker was being called to see extremely upper management. There was a lot of expression about his anxiety about that, about his fear that he was being fired. It was pretty clear to me that it wouldn't be what he expected. So this build-up, this repetition, it went on for a bit too long for me. Once we get into the story though, when Mr. Baker reaches the island, the only parts that pulled me out, there were some philosophical discussions among the adults that I felt were a little bit forced. Those are my overall impressions of the book, and before we jump into Goodreads to react to some of those reviews, I want to give you my star rating for this book, and I think I would give this a solid 4 out of 5 because I did really enjoy it. I am going to read the next book in this series. This book was from Linus's point of view, and I believe the next book is from Arthur's point of view, so I'm actually quite excited to read that. That book is called Somewhere Beyond the Sea, and it was only published in late 2024. That brings up another thing that I really liked about this book, which is the use of music. Mr. Baker and Lucy, one of the children, they connect over their shared love of music, and even though it's not my taste in music, it's a lot of oldies, I recognized a lot of the lyrics, and a lot of the lyrics were incorporated into the book, but not in big italicized sections. It was done a little bit more subtly, and I really, really loved that. Now let's go ahead and jump into Goodreads. Here we are in Goodreads, and this book got quite high reviews as well, 4.38. Here we have the genres: fantasy, LGBT, romance, queer, and young adult magic. There wasn't too much magic in this book, but the parts that were shown to the reader, I really, really enjoyed. Okay, the distribution of reviews is what you would expect for the average rating to be 4.38. And now let's go ahead and sort by newest, reviews in English, and we'll start once again with the 5-star reviews. Here's a review by Ratushna. Quite possibly one of the best books I have read so far this year. This book has been on my TBR pile for so long, finally decided to give it a go. It's not the usual type of book I read, but boy was I surprised. The story really truly touched me, and it is so beautifully written and quite relatable too. Thoroughly enjoyed reading this book, and I highly recommend. This is a really sweet review to start with. I was also surprised by this book because I didn't quite know what to expect. I don't read anything about a book before I begin, so I roughly knew that this was fantasy, but I didn't realize it would be such a cozy and comforting read. It was very easy to read, and there were only a few things that stood out to me in terms of the use of certain words repeatedly. We see Linus sweat a lot. That really stood out to me. There was always sweat dripping down his neck, so I found it a bit distracting that he was described as being sweaty so much. And there was also one more thing that I actually just remembered that bothered me about this book, and that is that I felt like there was a bit of fat phobia in this book. There was just a lot of attention to that, and I really didn't think that that added anything to the story. So that was a part of the book that did bother me throughout. Let's check out the next review by Quilted Reads. I cried when I finished this audiobook. It was such a beautiful story. I'll never forget it. I hate I waited so long to read it. Thank you, TJ, for this incredible journey. It was a really beautiful story, and I also found that the way the author described the environment was also very, very well done. In terms of the island and the garden and the house and the forest, I really felt like the way the author wrote about the surroundings, it brought this book to life for me. Let's read one more 5-star review. This one's by Regan. A very good found family book that just felt like a hug. Chauncey might just be one of my favorite side characters ever. This is a found family book, and that is quite clear from the very beginning. Even though I didn't know anything going into this book, just learning about the main character's life when we first meet him. Linus lives alone. He has a job that he's good at, but doesn't particularly bring him any joy. He doesn't really have any family or friends to speak of. His cat is kind of indifferent about him. So there is a lot that's missing in his life. It's very dreary. It's in shades of gray rather than in vivid color. So knowing all that about Linus when you first meet him, you kind of suspect that this is going to be a book about found family, and it definitely was. And I generally love the found family trope, especially when it's done well. Let's now move on to the 4-star reviews. Here's a review by Becky. 4.5 stars. I don't normally read fantasy books, and I was a bit hesitant at first, but by a few chapters I started to enjoy the book. It was a lovely, heartwarming comfort read, and I loved the characters and where it was set. Half a star lost, as it did feel like a children's book at times with all of the life lessons, and the ending was very predictable. Yeah, I would say that the ending was predictable. It's a found family trope. So Linus finds a place of belonging, but there are things that pull him away. So he leaves, and then he later realizes that that is where he belongs, so he goes back. The entire storyline, I would say, like the broad strokes, were quite predictable, but there were still a few surprise elements that kept it very interesting for me, especially with the children and the magical creatures, seeing the things that they can do and their personalities. I found that that was probably the most enjoyable part of the book for me. The next review is from Thamvav. Cute, whimsical, funny, and heartfelt. Made me think of Good Omens here and there. At times a bit on the nose, and sometimes ideas are only superficially explored, but then again, for a YA book with a main message of kindness, it might be enough this way. It also makes you fly through the book. I had a good time. Overall, I'd agree that the main message in this book is kindness. There are a lot of layers in this book, a lot of instances of othering, whether someone looks different or acts different, or is even led to believe that they are evil or monsters. There's a lot of judgment in this book, a lot of othering, and trying to move past that. So I would say that that part isn't sugar-coated at all. A lot of people who just aren't willing to be open-minded, to look past differences, to try to find similarities and commonalities. There's a lot of that in this world, and this book definitely shows that. But it's also a story of resilience, especially in a marginalized community. And of course, this is fantasy, so the marginalized community in this book in particular have more to do with the magical creatures and people fearing creatures who have powers. I would say it's quite similar to the concept of X-Men. For me, I did find myself thinking about a lot of things beyond what was in this book in terms of real life situations that happen between people. Let's read one more 4-star review, and this one's from Julia. So tender. Truly a feel-good read through and through. I love the chosen/found family trope, and this definitely delivered on that front. The ending, in my opinion, felt a bit rushed, or like they added too many new plot points right before the book ended, but still very lovely, somewhere between 3.5 and 4 stars. I would agree with this, although I found the ending not necessarily rushed. I think the epilogue could have packed a bigger emotional punch if it had been a little more succinct. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy the ending. I did find it quite satisfying, but there was just a lot there, and I don't think it all needed to be there. Now let's move on to the 3-star reviews. Here's one from Dylan. Really good and fun story. Felt more like a children's book and had me a little less interested, hence the 3-star, but still good overall, and I would recommend to younger people. I would agree with this review, and I feel like it's very fair. It did feel like it was written for a younger audience. For example, I found the romance parts very, very subtle, even though as an adult, you know what is happening, you know what the author is alluding to. The next review is not too long. This one's by Jessica. Hold on to your hats. Another finally, she finished a book off of the 6-month-long TBR list, and for fluffy book club no less. I feel so free now that this is done. I'm born again. I don't really understand that, but I'm sharing in Jessica's joy. This was a hard book to initially fall into a groove with. Once I was halfway through, I enjoyed it a lot more. It was adorably cute and beautiful with its themes of found family and belonging. The idea is quirky and wonderful and unique, but I was a tad bored. Controversial, I'm sorry. This would have been a 4-star read if not for the boredom on my behalf. I think this is a fair review too, and I can see why someone would be bored reading this book, although I personally was not bored. But again, it wasn't a page turner for me, even though there were little elements of surprises and I enjoyed getting to know the characters. I do love the quirkiness in this book. I really thought the characters came to life in terms of their personalities. This review isn't too long, but it looks like it is cut off. Let's go ahead and read it because I think all of the reviews have been pretty short so far. This one is by Rochelle. I was uncertain about reading this book because of the information about how the author borrowed from the history of residential schools and the 60s scoop within Canada. In reading the story and knowing the realities of residential schools and the 60s scoop within Canada, the parallels are omnipresent. The truths of residential schools and the 60s scoop can be seen and understood in the narratives of experiences of the youth and ideologies of the Department of Magical Youth. I was charmed by the queer love stories and the presentation of a world that... Oh, I want to read the rest of this review, but it cuts off. I had no idea that the author of this book borrowed from the history of residential schools and the 60s scoop. This is quite a dark part of Canada's history where Indigenous children were essentially taken from their homes and put in these residential schools. These were run by the government in conjunction with the Catholic Church. There were horrible atrocities that happened within these schools, and it was essentially an attempted genocide. So this is definitely new information to me. I did a quick Google search on this, and it looks like the author had parts of the story in mind. He knew he wanted to have magical people dealing with fear and discrimination. Specifically, it would involve magical children. He also knew about the main character, what Linus would be like, and this department in the government that is in charge of magical youth. So he had all of these pieces, but he didn't know how to connect them all together. And when he learned about the 60 scoop, which is what happened in Canada with the residential schools, he did a bit more research and he learned that this happens in a lot of different places where families are essentially separated from their children because they are different, because of this othering that happens so often in human history. So it sounds like he took that element, and that is how he came up with the idea that these magical youth would be in orphanages. Now, reading this book, I had no idea that this was the inspiration. I didn't even realize that these orphanages were children that were plucked from homes. I thought these were magical youth whose parents had died. It looks like there is quite a controversy with this because the 60s scoop is such a painful part of history and it was an attempted genocide. I can definitely see why people would be upset, especially with the theme of found family. You're kind of implying that some people who are plucked from their homes are better off in these found families. And while that is an idealistic way to look at the world, I think what bothers people is that it trivializes the experiences of the people who actually went through this and from the families whose children were plucked from their lives. So, wow, I'm really, really glad I read this review because I would not have learned about this otherwise. Let's now move on to the 2-star reviews. And I'm getting quite nervous about these now that I know that there's a controversy around this book. Okay, this is quite a long review, so I think I will just read one 2-star review before moving on to the 1-star. This one's by Melinda. This was fairly typical of the writing I've seen of TJ Klune thus far. I'm not a fan of his style of writing. It was, however, a better written book than Under the Whispering Door, so it gets 2 stars. The very condensed version is that the characters are cute, the romance actually makes a bit of sense, but the writing is still very lacking. Let's start with what is likable about this book. I was amused by the distinctly horrid and gray life in the city that is the author's depiction of corporate America set in fantasy but feeling like a real critique. Extremely upper management is amusing, as is the way that everyone is so frightened of them, particularly Linus. I personally cannot hear the name Linus without thinking of Charlie Brown and the character that always has a blanket. This was distracting for me, but is clearly not the author's fault that I have this association. The characters are largely very likable, fun, and unique. I like that we don't over-explain them too much. We don't go on and on about what forest sprites can do, we just mention them and move on in a way that implies there is a lot to know about them and we don't need to get into it right now. I loved Chauncey, a character that nobody quite knows what exactly he is. He is delightfully bubbly and enthusiastic and my absolute favorite. I think the cast of characters at this magical orphanage were the best part of the story. The boy who had a very traumatic past before he arrived, the 2 characters that are either imaginatively threatening or gruffly making faux threats, Theodore who has a hoard of treasures, they were all cute. I liked that we were allowed to have reservations about them at the beginning, but grow to love them as Linus does throughout the story. I love the adventures they go on. The way that they are all a family is realistic and beautiful. I love the way each magical child and character has a unique interest: old music, treasure, writing, gardening, nature. I thought the interactions with the village weren't given enough room to breathe. Since the tension with the village was one of the main threats, I think more nuance and detail on what sort of interaction they'd had in the past might have been more interesting and improved the plot. Out of nowhere, we find out about Arthur's past just in time for an interaction with the village. This didn't make sense to me as it was pushed forward with hints from extremely upper management that Linus needed to find out more about Arthur so that they could have information, but clearly they already knew about him. This made the story around Arthur's past feel a bit muddy and contrived. Perhaps if we'd had hints from him about how he knows about what it takes to overcome trauma, that these were the things that pushed Linus to be curious. However, this is minor. In this book, the romance is very contained, and yet there is not only implied conversation and feeling, but the conversations actually begin on the page, and it is very heavily implied that they continue off screen. You actually get a sense that these 2 characters are getting to know one another and come to appreciate each other at the same time. In the book Under the Whispering Door, I honestly couldn't figure out how we were meant to believe that the characters that end up together had fallen in love in the story. In this book, it is not the main story, but the seeds of that romance are clearly present. Okay, now for the writing. I do not like this author's writing style. I gave this book a try on many recommendations from many different people, and while I liked the children, I can't really say I liked the book that much. I will not be joining the ranks of the TJ Klune superfans. To me, the writing feels flat, as though he has an incredibly rich world built in his mind, and he is watching this beautiful movie in his head, and he sits down and transcribes what is showing on his screen. It felt to me like reading the medieval Latin translation edition of the Bible. Linus went to the train. He had to sit down. He reached into his pocket to get his train ticket. It was crumpled. He tried to smooth it out. He smiled. Yes, of course it's better than that with more words, but it feels like a very direct transcription of a movie that feels this flat to me. I would have preferred a writing style that went something like this instead. Linus still felt a bit uneasy about the journey, and yet his feet carried him onto the train automatically as the doors opened. He supposed city life had trained him to act so automatically. When the conductor arrived for his ticket, Linus reached into his pocket and found he'd crumpled the edges. Somehow the crumpled ticket made him feel even less ready for this upcoming job, like he was a ticket being put somewhere unsuitable. Would he end up crumpled or even worse? Better not to dwell on it. He tried to straighten the edges before he handed it over to the conductor, smiling a slightly embarrassed smile in the process. Okay, worse for last. I can't handle this writing style because there are too many darn unfinished sentences. Every time there is dialogue of any importance, I swear to you, the character sputters and says, well, but, I was, and so on and so forth. Usually multiple times in a single line of dialogue, almost in every dialogue exchange. It's better than the amount of times it happens in Under the Whispering Door. I didn't count this one, but it's still bad. If you can't write dialogue about feelings, then I implore you not to make the most important feelings a dialogue that I can't read. Make the characters write a letter or have them say the feelings in their mind, and at least write about their facial expressions. There's a mini rant about writing, but this review is really long, so I'm gonna skip this part. Yes, the story is cute. No, it isn't enough to excuse the poor writing. If you aren't bothered by the lack of complete sentences, you might be fine with this book and this author. It is better than Under the Whispering Door, mainly because more of the sentences are complete. I think Under the Whispering Door would have been a better book if the author had finished the sentences he started. If you read any of these as audiobook, the reader tends to soften the effect of the incomplete sentences. You don't get the massive sense of all the pauses because the reader shortens them and makes them sound better. It still isn't good enough for me, but I can see where an audiobook would work a lot better for some people. I wonder very seriously about the editing process. Does the editor think, A, he makes a lot of money, he can write as many incomplete sentences as he wants? These books could be so much better if someone had said, hey, this was going to be a really critical moment emotionally, but you're not putting any of it on the page. I'd love to see more of the internal feelings here. Maybe they are all listening to the audiobook and it's close enough and they don't really want depth. I don't know. I just know that the incomplete sentences means I won't be reading any more of his books. All right, I feel bad about skipping this mini rant, so I'll leave it on the screen in case you want to read it yourself, but I have a lot of thoughts. The first thing I want to say is I loved all of the children, as I mentioned, but I think my favorite character, aside from Lucy, of course, is Sal. Sal has this ability where if he is frightened, he turns into a Pomeranian. So that was just very, very delightful to me. He's also very perceptive, in part because he turns into a Pomeranian, so apparently he has extra good hearing, but he seems also beyond that to be very perceptive. I loved how when the kids were sharing their self-expression, he read this beautiful, I guess it would be like a poem to the class, and I just thought it was wonderful. It made several appearances in the book and it had different meanings and different layers to it. I just loved visualizing this shy teenager reading this beautiful poem, and later we find out that he loves to write, which is very fitting. Even though I loved all the children, I would say like fairly equally, Sal's story stood out to me the most. I do agree with a lot of this review up until the part about the writing. The incomplete sentences didn't bother me. They did happen, but I didn't find it to be excessive. In human conversation, this happens a lot where people cut each other off. I find, especially when feelings are involved, this tends to happen a lot. So maybe that's why in audiobook it sounds a lot more believable, because this happens in real life. Whereas when you're reading it, it seems maybe a little bit more distracting, although I personally wasn't distracted by it. I didn't mind the writing at all. I liked that it was straightforward and easy to read. The section that this reviewer wrote in terms of the crumpled ticket and offering an alternative way to describe that, I actually found that harder to read, and I wouldn't personally enjoy a book that was written like that. For me, it's a bit too explicit in terms of what the character is feeling. I, as a reader, want to interpret that for myself. Once again, I think this boils down to a difference in personal opinion in terms of what books we like to read. So I agreed with everything in this first part of the review, but where the review shifts to critiques of the writing, that's where we diverge in terms of our opinions. Last category, the 1-star category. Here's a review by Alicia. After listening to 70% of this book, I learned the author's inspiration was the 60s scoop. I can't imagine using something so horrific as inspiration for fantasy. I doubt I'll ever be able to finish it. This is a fair review, even though as someone who writes, I know that we can be inspired by a lot of things. The creative process isn't linear, and even if we hear about something horrific, it can spark an idea for us. But I can also see the other side where a reader would be put off by that, especially because it seems very insensitive. Okay, I think I'm going to end with this one. Kim gave this book 1 star. I knew going in that this was a YA book, but based on the description and reviews, I admit I was expecting something like Harry Potter, high expectations. Unfortunately, they were not met. I don't think I have ever met a book that was more obvious in its messages and more predictable. Yes, the messages are valid and important, but so repetitive and strong. The author apparently thinks his readers, even YAs, are stupid and must be hit over the head to understand that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, that prejudice is bad, that love is love, and that all people have value. I should have DNF, and I don't know why I didn't. I did listen to the Audible version, and the narrator was quite good with the different voices. I do think expectations play a lot into your enjoyment of something, not just with books, but with a lot of things. If you have really high expectations, there's a good chance that you'll be disappointed. And if your expectations are really low, there's a good chance that you'll be pleasantly surprised. I definitely enjoyed this book more than this reviewer. I almost feel like this reviewer felt insulted by the messages in this book, even if true, they were too obvious. I don't really have a problem with that. That only stood out to me really in one section of the book, the philosophical exchange, as I mentioned, but I think the delivery was just not something that this reviewer appreciated. That is it for my review of The House in the Cerulean Sea. If you've read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts. That's going to be it for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will be back very soon with another one. Until then, please take care and bye for now.